I'm going to talk to you about a very specific artifact that is called the Throne of Dagobert. And I'm not going to bore you with the details of dating it and describing it and so on. This has been done very well and very thoroughly. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that this artifact has been considered to be one of the symbols of power of the French kings during the Middle Ages by historians today. And the thing is that I disagree with that, and I'm going to argue about this, and I'm going to try to convince you of my argument. So yes, so there are 4 parts to this presentation. The first one will be hopefully a concise presentation of the artifact itself and its history. Then I will explain that hypothesis, that premises that it's a seat for the French king's displays of power. Then I will dispute that, and then I will explain what then can be said of the throne and its iconography. So first of all, the Throne of Lagobea. This is a unique piece of furniture that is from medieval Europe. It is made of a lead alloy that was originally coated in golden paint, and it was first mentioned by Suger in the inventory of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which he wrote in 1147. Suger was the abbot of Saint-Denis, and he was also counselor to the French kings Louis VI and his son Louis VII during the 12th century. The Abbey of Saint-Denis is a very famous building. It still stands today, at least the basilica still stands, and it was founded a few kilometers north of Paris at the end of the 5th century, and it quite quickly became a very important center of Christianity in the Merovingian kingdoms, especially during the reign of Dagobert I, king of the Franks, from 629 to 639. Its importance only grew as it became the place of burial of the royal families from the 7th century onwards. During the 12th century, however, the aura of the abbey was perhaps diminishing a little, especially in comparison with the Cathedral of Reims, where the French kings were crowned. So when Suger, who was educated at Saint-Denis, became its abbot in 1135, it was determined to put the abbey back in the forefront of politics. During the restoration of the abbey that he had ordered, Suger found a seat, old and broken, he wrote, that he identified as the great throne upon which Dagobert used to sit when ruling in Saint-Denis. The seat is made of 2 main parts. The bottom comprises of 4 upright legs in the shape of the front part of a panther. So you have the bottom part here, the 4 uprights, which are shaped in the shape of the front part of a panther. This is called a protome. And these uprights are linked together with an X-shaped articulation that allows the structure to be folded. This part, this bottom part, is supposed, or at least it's thought to be the oldest. And then there's an upper part, which is comprised of a backrest and 2 armrests. And they were probably added later. After Suger rediscovered it, the seat went through a series of restorations, which are known from meticulous observation of the artifact and from written sources. So we know, for example, that Suger restored it between 1135 and 1147, though we do not know to which extent. Then we know that a goldsmith made another round of repairs at the end of the 13th century. Then the leather seat was changed in 1587. During these centuries, from the 12th century to the 16th centuries, we do not know precisely how the seat was used. We only know that it was still curated, it was still in Saint-Denis. Then during the 17th century, there is a mention of a priest using it for mass at the high altar. Then at the beginning of the 18th century, it somehow became out of order and was stored on top of a cupboard. Then Napoleon Bonaparte took it out of its retirement in 1804 and used it at the Camp de Boulogne when he distributed the first batch of Légion d'honneur. This is likely when the seat suffered its last restoration, which was poorly done and actually blocked it in a half-open position. It's not very obvious here, but it's not actually open entirely. Some of these restorations are visible on the seats. One of the upright legs, two of the sleepers, one of the transverse bar. So the sleeper is this kind of part, the upright is upright. And then there are one of the transverse bar. So the transverse are the ones in diagonal. And so some of these, and as well as the discs of the articulation, show variation from the rest of the bottom part in color and in texture. The problem is that even though it varies, we don't know exactly when these modifications were made. So what we can say is that that's what we have on the drawing here, on the CAD drawing here, is that everything is gray is probably from the original seat. Everything in purple has been modified or added later. We'll talk about the date after. During the French Revolution, the Throne of Dagobert, as it became known, was then transferred to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where it's still curated today. During the 19th century, studies and analysis of the artifacts began to flourish. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, many researchers tried to establish a chronology of the seats, making it alternatively a Roman, a Merovingian, or a Carolingian product. Dating it is very difficult, as there is no way of dating the metal with lab analysis, and the artifact is unique. There is no comparison possible as the whole object. Only the decorative elements can be compared to other elements from artifacts or media, especially the feline protomb, the palm leaves, and the rosettes on the armrest here. Today, following the conclusions of Daniel Gabory-Chopin, who's an art historian at the Louvre Museum, the consensus is that the bottom part, is probably to be dated from the late 8th century, while the armrests and the backrests were added during the 9th century. So you can see already from those dates that Dagobert, who died in 639, has probably nothing to do with the seat, but the name stays. My paper, however, as I said in the introduction, has nothing to do with dating, even though there are lots of controversies about it. And that is a fascinating question, but that's not the question today. What I would like to talk about is the fact that this seat has been linked to the image of the French kings from the 12th century onwards. According to a widespread and largely unchallenged idea, after Suger's rediscovery of the seat, the French kings supposedly started to use it for important ceremonies at Saint-Denis and elsewhere, including during the coronation. This hypothesis, widespread today, is not based on any written sources. There are no written sources that say this seat was used in such and such occasion. The main clue usually put forward to support this idea is that in 1141, King Louis VII started using a new kind of seal in Majesty, where it is represented on what looks to be an X-shaped seat with animal heads at its extremities. So this is what we have here, that seal, and you can see this seat with animal heads and feet representation and probably an X-shaped structure. This new shape was so distinctive that it became a symbol for the French kingdom, and only French kings and their allies used it until the 16th century. So a lot of the French kings after Louis VII used it for their seals in Majesty. In comparison, English and German monarchs were represented on a more massive type of seat, known from manuscripts from a long time and less specific. Experts in the study of royal seals have been quick to make a link between the Throne of Dagobert, rediscovered around 1135 by Suger, and the new throne depicted on the French royal seals from 1141 onwards. After all, the date coincides. Suger was very influential on Louis VII. The aura of Saint-Denis only grew after its restoration campaign, and the idea that this seat was the very throne upon which French kings used to sit is quite seducing. And that's how this seat is usually being presented today, an ancient throne upon which many French kings have sat, a symbol of their power. So you see me coming now. The problem is that nothing actually quite adds up the way seal experts make it believe. First, let's talk about seat typology and morphology. The throne of Dagobert is often identified as one example of a curule seat from the Middle Ages, sella curilis in Latin, curule seat. Curule seats with curved feet and the variant with straight feet are two forms of one of the oldest types of seats that are known, which is called an X-shaped folding stool. This type of seat is very old, and it's found all over Western and not so Western world, found in ancient Egypt, in ancient Greece, Bronze Age Western Europe, during the Roman times, and so on. It is often linked with positions of power. During the Roman times, for example, the curule seat was especially a symbol of the power of the Senate during the Republic, then taken over by the emperors and often depicted on coins. So you have here these curule seats with the curved feet, and you have otherwise example of straight X folding stool. The variant with straight feet is also known from archaeological sources, especially found in aristocratic graves in the early Middle Ages in northern Italy, Hungary, Germany, northern France, and England. This type of seat is also found on images from the 9th century onwards, especially with religious people of power sitting on it. So we have bishops, we have abbots, the saints, the Virgin and the Child, and so on. From the 11th century onwards, we also have lay people of power beginning to be represented on such seats, kings, counts, dukes, and so on. So it would be very fitting that the throne of Dagobert would be such a seat with long-lived affinity with power. Again, the problem is the throne of Dagobert is not such a seat. First of all, it is not a stool. A stool is a seat with only a bottom part, with no backrest or armrest. It might have been a stool in its probable first form during the 8th century. However, when Suger rediscovered it in the 12th century, it was already an armchair with a backrest and with armrests. Second of all, it is not an X-shaped seat either. It has a folding mechanism that is in the shape of an X, but the overall structure of the seat stands on 4 uprights, not on 4 transverse that cross and make an X. So you have an example of an X-shaped folding stool on the left here, found in Brenny in the north of France. And you can see clearly that the structure stands on the X shape, while the throne of Dagobert here stands on the 4 uprights. That is important. These are 2 very distinct morphologies that cannot be confused. And third of all, nothing in the structure of the throne of Dagobert is curved. So it is not a curule seat either. So the throne of Dagobert is neither an X-shaped stool nor a curule seat. Second, if we come back to the iconography of the seals, this iconography of the seal of Louis VII and his successors doesn't really match the throne of Dagobert either. They look like, for Louis VII, for example, as well as for his son Philip II and for Louis VIII, we have representations that can be a bit ambiguous. They look like X-shaped stools, but the presence of textile and the simplification, due to the seal format, make it hard to identify it surely. But in any ways, these seats are not the throne of Dagobert. There is no backrest, no armrests, and the feet are not straight and don't really like protones. The following kings are more clearly depicted on X-shaped seats. So we have Philip III here, Philip IV here as well, Louis X, Philip VI as well here. And so these are clearly X-shaped seats. Only Philip IV here, which reigned during the late 13th and the early 14th century, is depicted on the seat with lion protones in a very original image. So what clearly appears is that there is a wide variation on the depiction of the French kings on their seals in majesty. Others, some are seated on what could be interpreted as X-shaped stools, but without certainty. These are the first few ones. Others are clearly on those kind of seats. So we have the few ones after that. And then we have some that are clearly not seated on X-shaped stools, but rather on seats with uprights. The only common trait here is the absence of a backrest, the absence of armrests, and the presence of animal figures at the end of the structures. But none of these depictures are dead ringers for the throne of Dagobert, and least of all the seat of Louis VII here, which is supposed to be the one with the most important link. Speaking of animal figures, we can also see that they are quite varied. Most of them are only vaguely feline. That's the case with Louis VII here, Philip II, Philip III. Sometimes they are more clearly leonine, such as with Louis X, but they can also be something else entirely. Charles V here is represented with stylized dolphins. So this variety in animals is the clue to the true meaning of these representations. They are not images of an existing throne, but they are figures of the symbol of power. Here, it is an X-shaped seat with animal heads and feet. Usually, a lion is represented, as it slowly became considered the king of animals in Western Europe from the 12th century onward, and a prevailing figure in symbolic iconography. In the case of Charles V's the dolphins, it refers to the fact that he was the first French prince to inherit the Dauphiné region in 1349, which then gave the name of Dauphin to the eldest son of French kings waiting to inherit the kingdom. So, clearly, the images depicted on the seals of French kings, beginning with Louis VII, contemporary of Suger, and of the rediscovery of the throne of Dagobert, are not as consistent as usually thought. Moreover, they clearly do not represent the throne of Dagobert. But the plot thickens if we start looking at the seals of the predecessors of Louis VII, including his father Louis VI and his grandfather Philip I, who are represented on seats with uprights, not on X-shaped structure. And these seats with uprights are stylized with protomes more or less identifiable as feline. And they look a lot more like the throne of Dagobert, though without the armrest of the backrest. We can't see it. It doesn't mean it's not represented, but we can't see it. The king who are supposed to be represented on the throne of Dagobert are clearly not, rather depicted on an X-shaped stool. And the kings who are represented on what could possibly be identified as the throne of Dagobert preceded its miraculous rediscovery by Suger. And that is puzzling and quite contradictory, as the common idea that the throne of Dagobert was used as a strong symbol of power and a tool of royal power by the kings of France following Suger's restoration of it in the mid-12th century. So now we can ask then, what was the real use of the seat during the Middle Ages, both before and after Suger's mention of it? That is a very good question, if I may say so, and we don't actually have an answer. Seats with uprights in the shape of a feline protomes are rarely found in medieval iconography. It is a motif that is very well known in the Roman world, but not very much in the medieval world. So we find it actually in a few manuscripts of the early medieval period with clear Italian and Byzantine influences. That is the case with the Utrecht Psalter, with the Harley Psalter, or with the Igbo Gospels, which are represented here. There is, however, one representation of such a seat that is very interesting to us. That is the fourth image here. This is the portrait of Lothair, Carolingian emperor from 840 to 855, found in the Gospels of Lothair, made in the middle of the 9th century. The resemblance of the seat here with the throne of Dagobert is quite uncanny, though once more the drapes of Lothair and Lothair's clothes hide many details. But is it the same seat? Well, maybe it could be. It resembles it a lot, and as well, his half-brother, Lothair's half-brother, Charles II, was lay abbot of Saint-Denis, and he was very generous with the abbey. So it could have been one of the many gifts he offered to the abbey, but there is absolutely no proof of it. That is wild speculation. Other interesting questions to ask are, why the change? Why the change in representations of seats on the French royal seats in majesty? The first kings represented seated in majesty were Robert II and Henry I on massive seats, such as the one that I showed for the King of England and for the German Emperor. Then we have these images with Philip I and Louis VI, who changed these massive seats for seats with uprights, with tools, with protomes. And then again, we have Louis VII, who changed it for this new image of an X-shaped stool, and that kind of seat was used on seals until the 16th century. So why the changes, and is the throne of Dagobert linked to any of it? So far, nothing leads to concluding that this is the case. There is no clue about that for now. Concerning the X-shaped stool, I mentioned that religious people of power were often seated on them in medieval iconography, but also in reality. We have several examples of folding stools found in monasteries that are known from the Middle Ages. So I put a few examples here. These are three of the most well-known, best-known examples that are found coincidentally in Austria. I'm sure there are more in monasteries in anywhere else in Europe, but these are from Austria. What is interesting here is that during the middle of the Middle Ages, this type of seat was linked to power, yes, but a lot to religious power. And the question that can be asked is that, is the representation of Louis VII on such a seat to be linked to the fact that he was at first not supposed to be king, but to be a monk, because he was not the first born. He had an older brother, and that older brother died unexpectedly, and Louis had to take over. He was notoriously not very happy about it. He was a very religious person. That's a factor that played a lot in his tumultuous relationship with his first wife, Aliénor of Aquitaine. And he was very close to the clergy, was very close to the church, and was very pious. So could we read in the change of seat in his seal an allusion to his wish to be a man of religion rather than to be a man of state? Once again, this is wild speculation. There is no indication, but that could be a clue. In conclusion, what can we say about the throne of Dagobert? We can say that we don't really know its origin, though it probably dates back to the Carolingian period. We can say that we don't know how it came to Saint-Denis, though it might be through Charles II. We don't know who really used it, apart from the 7th century, apart from the modern contemporary periods. And so we don't know much, actually. What we do know is that Suger very cleverly linked this seat to Dagobert, who was the last Merovingian king with proper power, and the one who was the most generous to the abbey of Saint-Denis. And we know that despite the coincidence in dates, it is very much not the seat that is represented on Louis VII and his successors' seals. So, to answer the question of my title, I think the seat was a very clever tool of propaganda by Suger, but it was most likely never used as a throne by medieval kings. Though, again, we do not have a definitive answer because clues are very scarce and it's still very much a work in progress. I thank you for your attention.
Laura is a PhD student at the School of Art History and the School of Modern Languages at the University of St. Andrews. She also runs the online public project Las Plumas de Sīmurgh on Twitch, which I don't know very much about Twitch, but where she streams about mythology, art, history, and literature in Iran and Mesopotamia. Her research focuses on the mythical bird Sīmurgh from the medieval poem The Book of Kings and its representation in both art and literature. And her paper today is entitled Royal Symbols from Above, Sīmurgh and the Representation of Kings in Medieval Persian Manuscripts.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you to the organizing committee for considering my proposal worth to be included in this conference. It is with great pleasure that I am going to share a bit of my research here today. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I would have given you a little taste of the fascinating world that is medieval Iran. The literature element plays a key role in my presentation, and for the sake of a better understanding, you will allow me a little bit of storytelling and a minimal dose of mythological references, but who does not enjoy a good sprinkle of storytelling? We're never too old to listen to stories. Of course, and like any paper given in a conference, my presentation here has a very long title with a lot of different ideas and subjects. I even allowed myself to be poetic royal symbols from above. First and foremost, we need to introduce the protagonist of this paper. This is the bird Sīmurgh, a mythological creature widely known in Iranian and Persianate cultures for featuring in the epic Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, written by the Persian author Ferdowsi in 1010. Sīmurgh plays a major role in the poem as an apotropaic figure, that is, a protective spirit for the descendants of the house of Nariman. And her role to safeguard this dynasty starts with the birth of Zal, a much desired prince that happens to be born with his hair and body completely white. Interpreting his albinism as a sign of misfortune, the baby is sent away by his father and abandoned in the wilderness at the skirts of the sacred mountain Damawand. There, the almighty Sīmurgh finds him, and by the intervention of God, she pities the newborn and takes him to live with her at the peak of Mount Alborz, a summit no mortal man could reach by their own means. From this moment onwards, the destinies of Zal and his descendants are intertwined with Sīmurgh's, who becomes his foster mother. In this image, you can see a very maternal scene with Zal sitting in the nest with his siblings, the chicks, and Sīmurgh coming back from a very successful hunting trip. Now that you know of her, I can tell you that in my doctoral research, I work precisely about her. My work is focused on the representation of Sīmurgh in both literature and iconography. But for this paper, I will share with you just a part of it, a part concerning with certain visual aspects of Sīmurgh and what meaning they may have. There is a wide variety of manuscripts where we could find Sīmurgh, but for this paper, I will just be working with mainly the Book of Kings, and some mentions to the Hamza of Nizami will be made. Despite the Book of Kings was finished in 1010, there are no illustrated copies of it until the 14th century. At least that is what we have preserved. The construction of the visual dimension of Sīmurgh was much more varied at that stage, but from the 15th century onwards, coincided with the rise to power of the Timurid dynasty in the Persianate, her iconography can be considered solidly established. The Timurid visual language, picking up the baton from the previous Ilkhanate and the Mongol heritage, shifted into a much more Far Eastern aesthetics and visual motifs. The image of Sīmurgh and its creation is strongly connected to Chinese art. However, it is important to include a disclaimer here. In the process of shaping her visual aspects, the Far East was not the only source of inspiration, although China and its artworks played a predominant role that would eventually be established as the iconography for Sīmurgh. All the artistic backgrounds are to be considered as well, because we should not forget the pictorial tradition from Western areas of the Arabian Peninsula or the Mediterranean. Especially when addressing the illustration of manuscripts, the influence of other artistic milieux must be considered to fully understand the creation of Sīmurgh's iconography. Nevertheless, the Far Eastern examples indeed represent the source from where the heaviest inspiration came from. Some other birds that play in its part in the concerto, that is the forge of Sīmurgh's visual dimension, are worth of mentioning, but because we cannot expand on this, we will focus only in one particular deity, a supernatural creature born from the winds, whose name is Fan Huang. And I publicly apologize to every proper Mandarin speaker in the audience for butchering its name. My knowledge of Chinese is limited and my nerves are not helping right now. Also, I would like to make a quick yet necessary digression here. Most probably, if you venture yourselves into a Google search, you will find Fan Huang being addressed as the Chinese phoenix. Sadly, more sources that I am willing to admit still use that word, phoenix. It is incorrect. Fan Huang is a wind deity, has little to nothing to do with fire, and by no means comes back to life after passing away, perpetuating certain terms, especially regarding mythology, for the sake of tradition or for the sake of the establishment in historiography, is not something we should presume. Calling Fan Huang or Sīmurgh phoenix is misleading and is inaccurate. These kind of translations should be revisited, reconsidered, and put aside to achieve a better and complete understanding of mythological creatures in different cultural contexts. This is the hill I will die on. It might not be the best, but it is mine. As I was saying, Fan Huang is a creature of the wind, and alongside with the dragon represents unity, the duality of the cosmos and the advent of a prosperous and heavenly sent rulership. By the Tang and Song periods, Fan Huang started to be associated with rulers and to be paired up with Huanglong, the yellow dragon of the center in the Chinese cosmovision. In this motif, the dragon represents masculine, yang, and the bird represents feminine, yin. Therefore, the dragon that was already linked to the yellow monarch and the first Chinese emperor came to represent the human, earthly emperor, and its companion, the bird, represented the empress. The iconography of Fan Huang is a symbol for the empress, and the bestowal of divine protection became central as an expression of iconographical legitimation. The motif of the bird traveled to Iranian lands and started to be imitated in a wide variety of media, textiles, ceramics, on also paper, on preparatory drawings. From the establishment of the Ilkhanid dynasty, a Mongol origin dynasty that became Iran's prominent political power and cultural as well, from 1256 to 1335, more or less, the images of this bird spread around a wide variety of media. The importance here is that what once was Fan Huang became not just imitated, but would be reinterpreted, readapted, and presented differently in Iranian artworks, because it was adjusting to a new self-defining iconographical narrative where the bird that matched the part almost perfectly was indeed Sīmurgh. Although Fan Huang and Sīmurgh have no connections in a literature-based level, they are both supernatural entities with great power and a great influence in the destiny of humankind. They are, without overlooking at the fact that they belong to different cultural atmospheres and moments, birds of great size, with no equal in strength and also no equal in wisdom. And here's a catch: Fan Huang had, in fact, a visual dimension, for it was described in many literary works from different periods in Chinese history. However, Sīmurgh is not described by Ferdowsi in the Shahnameh, so nobody actually knew how she looked like. These and other factors we cannot discuss today, I'm afraid, made possible that the iconography of Fan Huang worked so well and fitted perfectly into what the artists of the Ilkhanid period aimed to represent when giving Sīmurgh a visual dimension. I mentioned before the Timurid dynasty, and this is because their visual language turned, like once the Ilkhanids did, towards a Far Eastern inspired look as part of their own defining narrative and political legitimation that had great connections with Genghis Khan and the establishment of the Mongol Empire. I want you to understand that the process was not as simple as just taking the features of Fan Huang and transforming them into Sīmurgh. Iconography should not be detached of its symbolism and importance. Fan Huang's iconography presented itself in a royal manner, attached to the highest levels of society that held political and cultural power. Sīmurgh's representation fell into place as state iconography had already a great connection with values of legitimation, heavenly rule, justified rulership, divine order. Sīmurgh, therefore, became a symbol of identity and should be understood as such. She already was before her appearance in artworks. The Shahnameh itself holds a powerful identity feeling as it was created as a product of Iranian cultural heritage opposed to Arab culture. In the creation of the Book of Kings, there was an effort to highlight what was defined as Iranian or Persian identity. The Shahnameh is a narrative poem, and Sīmurgh before anything else, is a character from it. If we look through its illustrations, she could be easily identified by the text and the scenes where she features. For example, here we have the image on the left where she returned her son Zal to his biological father, or the image on the right where Zal summoned her in the night of the birth of his first son, because we all call mom when in panic, am I right? But the point of these images is that Sīmurgh is not a motif, but a character. She has an active role to play, and the illustration reflects that what the text is describing to us. However, and as we have seen in previous examples, she was represented in other media as well. This time, though, there is no text, so she is detached of her narrative dimension and the visual prevails. She became a decorative in many different formats and materials, and we need to consider that at this point, her iconography was so well established that into the pictorial language of what we call Persian art, or art from the Persianate, to be a little bit more inclusive, that the text was not necessary anymore. Her looks were enough to make her recognizable. Included and rooted as deeply as she was in the construct that was Persian visual identity, she could hardly be mistaken by all the supernatural creature or even by all the bird. And here is where our attention focuses on manuscripts entirely. From the late 15th century and early 16th century onwards, we can see Sīmurgh being represented in scenes where she would not belong primarily. That is, where she would not belong because her narrative character does not appear. Nevertheless, she is still there, and the majority of these scenes involve a character that has some significance, be it because of their lineage, their prowess, the political position they occupy, maybe a combination of all of them. Allow me to share with you that this part of the research finds its closest equal in the books Finding Wally, but the Shahnameh edition. I am pretty sure my site has gotten much worse, because you will find now that Sīmurgh has a very creative way of hiding herself. Let's start with possibly the most obvious character to be involved with Sīmurgh, her foster and dear son, Prince Zal. By the way, I need to make a quick shout out to the organizers of this conference. Thank you, Rogine, for using this image, because it's one of my favorites to promote in the poster. I was thrilled. So we've seen all the scenes already where Sīmurgh and Zal appear together. However, this is not a scene that narratively involves them. Zal is consulting the Magi in his court, and can you see Sīmurgh? This game is funnier to play with a live audience, so you can see people closing their eyes halfway and even leaning forward to see if they can actually spot her. So just for the sake of reassuring myself, I am imagining all of you at the other side of the screen actually leaning onto your laptops and looking for her. Allow me to help you. She's there in the canopy behind his son. So she's there, but she's not there. Her narrative self has been separated from her appearance, but that does not mean she has lost a milligram of her symbolic weight. The ubiquity of the bird is linked to her hiddenness, not to her display. Manuscripts are considered to be a great source of knowledge because they represent, or at least so we think, the customs of the time they belong to. I am talking specifically about the disposal of thrones and the ornamental elements attached to them. The use of canopies is something the Safavid courts did not invent, and it is neither a heritage used from a Eurasian or Far Eastern cultural influence. The Iranian courts already had fabric disposed around and behind the throne. I am thinking about the Achaemenids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids. But in this case, we see Sīmurgh incorporated in the iconographical display that accompanies royalty. But it's not only in canopies where we can find Sīmurgh. Garments, bowcases, quivers, and saddlecloths are scattered and abundant through manuscripts, and they all represent a number of common points. And in a high number of cases, she's attached both physically and symbolically to a prominent character for the narrative. Let's see a couple of examples here. I am delighted to introduce you to this string of characters from the Book of Kings. This is Sīmurgh, the son of the mountain king Kayumach, which I wish I had time to talk about. But what you need to know and understand is that what you're seeing, well, actually to understand what you're seeing is that Kayumars and his descendants established the first kingly court at the mountain. So that is the reason for this array of the court they seen being outside. Here we can also see Sīmurgh in the canopy in a hunting attitude. This was actually quite easy. And here we have another prominent hero of the Shahnameh, Bahram Guru, doing what he did best, which is hunting. I am going to give it a couple of seconds, so to see if you can indeed spot Sīmurgh. Again, she is a master of disguise. She's in the saddlecloth. And let me tell you, for I have the privilege to work with this page in my hand, she is the size of a pencil tip. She's tiny. I emphasize my ophthalmological situation is worsened so much in the last 4 years. Start a PhD, they say. It will be fun. All the examples of Sīmurgh in saddlecloths can be seen in this episode of Esfandia fighting the dragon. This is probably one of the most beautiful dragons ever depicted in Persian manuscripts, and that is not just my opinion, it's scientific fact. There is a beautiful contradiction here, because in the Shahnameh, Esfandia is the character who combats the male Sīmurgh and eventually kills him. Yet, we see the shape of the bird in his saddlecloth. The beauty of a contradiction, and also accompanying the minister of King Anushirvan, which is a Sasanian king. This is a real historical character. We can also see Sīmurgh in the back of the horse. The last of the heroes we are going to know of today is Khosrow Parviz, which is saved by the angel Soroush in this scene. Saving the hero in the nick of time cliché? Checked. Heroes of the Shahnameh simply enjoy dragging themselves into trouble. Trust me with this one. Sīmurgh appears in the hero's bow case. Yeah, and I know this one's quite difficult to see because of the light. When I was working with the page, I had to use my phone's torch to actually make Sīmurgh visible and incline the page. But Sīmurgh appears to have been a popular design for quivers and for bow cases in the 15th century, from the 15th century onwards, as these preparatory drawings from these albums show. The drawings would be used as a transfer media for all the materials, leather in this case, and also we have this illustration of an Uzbek prisoner where Sīmurgh appears in the bow case. So yeah, apparently this was something quite popular during the 16th and 17th centuries. The rulers of the Shahnameh have been mentioned, but in fact, Sīmurgh as an ornamental motif can be found in other manuscripts. Here, as part of Nizami Ganjovi's Hamsa, we have the episode of Eskandar speaking to a physician or Hakim. For those of you who might not know this, Eskandar is the Persian name of Alexander the Great. I guess it might be a little bit surprising seeing him dressed in this way, but you have to believe it was quite common for the time. Eskandar and its literary evolution were extremely popular during the Middle Ages in Iran and way beyond. Here, Sīmurgh appears as the pattern decorating Eskandar's robe. This style of patterned fabric was possibly a direct heritage from Chinese textiles, and once again, the figure of the supernatural bird was adapted and reinterpreted in order to serve a different purpose to engage with a different culturally or a culturally different audience. All the examples of Sīmurgh shown in fabric can be found in independent leaves with drawings like this one. I actually hope that you're able to see her because of the gold, but is there and repeated all over the image. So to summarize a little bit, Sīmurgh becomes a non-narrative ornamental element in the composition when she features as a decorative motif and not as herself. Her inclusion in the decorative aesthetics of these kings and heroes represented in the Shahnameh intended to be a reflection of the ruling courts that produced these manuscripts, the Safavids in this case. At the same time, the rulers are equal to those mythical kings and illustrious characters of the epic. Remember, the Shahnameh is an instrument to legitimize the rulers, and it was used as part of the visual propaganda by every single dynasty that rose to power and wanted to present themselves as the legitimate heirs of these mythical and glorious Persian past. I think I haven't said this enough, but the Shahnameh is fiction, is mostly based in historically episodes, but is a fiction piece. As a final example, I wanted to bring you to the court of the demon king, Zahog himself, who was cursed by the devil to have 2 black snakes sprouting from his shoulders. The snakes had to be fed with human brains, and they tormented the cursed king forever. So, surrounding a character like that, how was Sīmurgh going to be present? We won't be mistaken if we judge this character of Zahog to be very negative. However, Zahog is ruling in the court that previously belonged to Jamshid, the legitimate ruler, and therefore the demon king is surrounded by all these royal symbols in order to prove the throne is rightfully his. Thus, having Sīmurgh as a decorative element that supports this idea of legitimation does not imply any kind of endorsement, but is just attached to a very specific visual language linked to royalty, to kingship, and to ultimately the right to rule and the heavens' approval. In conclusion, Sīmurgh was incorporated to the visual language of the Iranian courts, not only as a character, but a pictorial motif and a symbol. The integration of visual symbols became a key element to legitimize the ruling powers, and in Persian manuscripts, we can see how supernatural creatures already connected with heavenly power and protection were used profusely, Sīmurgh being the precise case here. The powerfully rooted meaning she had as a protector of kings carried on to the independence of the bird as a motive, and depicting her detached from the text did not diminish her importance and significance. The readaptation and reshaping of different visual formats contributes in this manner to create a very specific pictorial language that goes beyond aesthetics and ventures into the realm of iconographical symbolism. The aesthetic of Sīmurgh had specific connotations of power, heavenly kingship, supernatural protection, and above all, legitimation. By detaching the character from the shape, this symbolism is highlighted, and ultimately, it perpetuates particular creatures, legends, and tales as an element of royal legitimacy, a legitimacy that surpasses human comprehension and comes from above, from the realms of the supernatural. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Khayli mamnoon.
Katherine received her master's in medieval art history from the University of Oxford in 2014, and then her PhD in medieval art history from Trinity College Dublin in 2018. Since completing her PhD, Katherine has worked in the Department of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and she's currently a visiting lecturer in the Department of Art History at the University of California, Riverside. Katherine's research interests encompass late medieval art and material culture, especially French manuscripts and ivories. And her paper this afternoon is entitled Ivories and Inventories, Tracing, Production, and Patronage in Late Medieval French Household Records. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here today. It's great that I can take part in this, like Roisin said, all the way from California. As the ruling Countess of Artois, noblewoman Mahau had the financial resources necessary to make lavish purchases, such as that of the ivory combs, brooch, and mirror described here. As a member of the nobility and the mother of 2 queens of France, it was important that she carefully curated her public image, even in matters as mundane as personal grooming. In addition to being fastidious about her appearance and legacy, Mahau was also adamant about keeping careful records of her household expenses. It is because of Mahau's insistence on careful bookkeeping that today, nearly 7 centuries after her death, we can explore the materiality of her life through the records of luxury objects she commissioned, bought, and owned during her tenure as Countess of Artois from 1302 to 1329. Mahau was not alone in maintaining extensive inventories. The 99-page post-mortem inventory of Clémence d'Hongrie, Queen of France and widow of Louis X, also provides a window into the material life of a female member of the late medieval French court. By examining the inventories of Mahau d'Artois and Clémence d'Hongrie, we can gain a better understanding of how these 2 French noblewomen utilized carved ivory objects as a material means of expressing their social, religious, and financial roles in 14th century French courtly culture. In late medieval France, objets d'art served as tangible records of wealth and social status. These objects' creation from a rare and highly prized material, paired with their high relief, finely executed carvings, suggests that they were available solely to those with large disposable incomes, namely the nobility and royalty. Household items that would today be considered utilitarian, such as mirror cases, combs, and trinket-sized boxes, misleadingly known as caskets from the French coffret, became lavish exemplars of their owner's power, wealth, and social prestige when rendered in ivory. From circa 1250 to 1350, elephant ivory was transported from Eastern Africa to France by Mediterranean merchants via the Straits of Gibraltar and the English Channel. The first half of the 14th century was the high point of Gothic ivory carving, with Paris as the major European center for production. The overall period of production for carved ivory objects was brief, lasting only until the beginning of the 15th century. However, the great skill and detail with which these objects were created imbued them with popularity and longevity, exemplified by their written inclusion in household inventories of the nobility and royalty, such as those of Mahal d'Artois and Clémence d'Angry. Sometimes consisting of multiple volumes or hundreds of pages, written by hand in parchment or paper registers, inventories provide an organized glimpse into the daily life and luxury of medieval nobles and royals. Each object in an inventory was provided with a brief description, detailing its appearance and sometimes its price and production. The two inventories that I will consider in this paper, those of Mahal d'Artois and Clémence d'Angry, were both created to serve as administrative checks of the owner's possessions. Mahal's and Clémence's inventories differ, however, in the reason for their compilation. Whereas Mahal's inventories were thrice annual records of household business during her rule as Countess of Artois, Clémence's inventory was created upon her death in 1328 at the behest of her last will and testament. Before delving into the inventories, it is important to understand the limitations of the information that medieval inventories can impart centuries after their creation. Although inventories are by definition carefully organized documents, they are subjective, not objective records. Every inventory is unique in terms of its overall organization, the details and information that are included or excluded, and the reason for its creation. In regard to carved ivories, the greatest limitation of medieval inventories is that they cannot serve as a panacea to questions of provenance. It is difficult to determine specific 14th century collections to which medieval ivories belonged, even with medieval inventories as textual records and guides. For example, although the aforementioned entry from Mahal's inventory makes it clear that the Countess owned 2 ivory combs, the entry does not provide enough descriptive information to determine which of the fairly large number of extant Gothic ivory combs may have been the 2 she possessed. This matching of specific ivories to specific inventories is made further difficult by the fact that the majority of French Gothic ivories follow accepted artistic patterns and representations. For example, there are 8 surviving composite caskets, small ivory boxes carved with popular scenes from romances for which the medieval owners are unknown. These 8 caskets are analogous in their depictions of various popular romances on the lids and 4 sides, including the trope of the siege of the Castle of Love, Lancelot crossing the sword bridge, and the tryst of Phyllis and Aristotle. Due to the great popularity of these romance-themed caskets in the late Middle Ages, we can hypothesize that more than the now extant 8 were originally created, and that were one to be included in an inventory, a description along the lines of ivory casket with various scenes from romances would not in and of itself be enough to identify a particular casket. A final quality of ivories that inventories are unable to shed light on is that unlike medieval manuscripts, which sometimes contain inscriptions speaking to their production or ownership, Gothic ivories include no medieval written or carved clues about the identity of their creators or owners. This makes it especially difficult not only to attribute a carved ivory to a specific workshop, but also to trace its patronage and ownership. For example, one of the 8 composite caskets, now in Krakow Cathedral Treasury, is believed to have been owned by the 14th century Queen Jadwiga of Poland, former Princess of Hungary, although no known written documents attest to her ownership. Rather, Queen Jadwiga was connected to the casket due to her great interest in luxury French goods and the presence of such objects at her court. Thus, it is difficult to assign carved ivories to specific medieval owners by relying solely on entries within medieval inventories. However, despite this limitation, there is still much that can be learned about Gothic ivories, their producers, and patrons through the examination of entries in medieval household records of the nobility and royalty, such as those of Mahaut d'Artois and Clémence d'Hongrie, to whom I will now turn. Mahaut, Countess of Artois, was the wife of Otto IV, Count Palatine of Burgundy, and the mother of two queens of France, Jean II of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy. Mahaut was also regent of the county of Burgundy for her son, Robert, from the time of her husband's death in 1302 to the unfortunate death of her son in 1315. As countess, she ruled over two counties, Artois and Bourgogne. Mahaut's familial history and connections illustrate her lofty social position, which brought her great wealth as well as social and political influence, enabling her to play an active role as an aristocratic patron of Parisian ivories. The surviving inventories from the late medieval artisan household date to Mahaut's rule as countess, from the death of her husband Otto IV in 1302 to her own death in 1329. These inventories, written on parchment registers, consist of two parts, receipts and expenses, and were typically presented by the treasurer 3 times per Christian calendar year on Candlemas, Ascension Day, and All Saints' Day. Of the hypothesized 84 inventories that were produced during Mahaut's reign, 31 are still extant. Mahaut's household inventories prove that the countess owned several carved ivory objects. From her carefully organized household inventories, it can be inferred that in addition to caring for the two counties over which she reigned, Mahaut was also an enthusiastic patron of the arts, using her wealth and status to patronize some of Paris's most skilled artisans, not only of ivory carving, but also of manuscript production and goldsmithery. Clémence de Hongrie's situation was much different. Born and raised in Naples, at age 22, Clémence journeyed to France to become the second wife of King Louis X. However, she did not have the chance to establish herself at the French court before the death of her husband, less than a year after their marriage, and son 5 months later. These tragedies resulted in an abrupt downgrade of her royal status, causing Clémence to struggle to gain the social position and financial freedom which allowed Mahaut to commission great works of art. As directed by Clémence, age 35, in her last will and testament, dictated on October 5, 1328, upon her death, her possessions and property were inventoried and liquidated. While some of the most unique and lavish objects were gifted to friends and family members, the majority were sold. In her will, Clémence made clear her wish that her luxury items be sold for a fair price, without discounts or payment plans being offered to buyers, regardless of their social status. This signifies the high regard in which Clémence held these objects, as well as her attempt to control their movement and worth even after her death. Were Mahaut and Clémence to have met, as is probable for two women moving in the rarefied circle of the late medieval French royal court, it was likely not under friendly conditions. Clémence was related by marriage to Mahaut, who was the mother-in-law of Clémence's brother-in-law, Philippe V. In 1316, Clémence found herself on the wrong side of Philippe V when she sided with Mahaut's nephew, Robert III d'Artois, rather than with Mahaut on a disagreement over who should rule the county of Artois. This was a dangerous position to be in as the widow of Louis X, the brother of Philippe V, who was now in charge of dispensing income to Clémence. Luckily, Clémence and Philippe V had settled their disagreement by the next year. Despite this conflict and their difference in age and social position, as late medieval royal women, Mahaut and Clémence had other experiences in common. Both were the second wives of high-ranking members of the French nobility, and both outlived their husbands. Mahaut and Clémence also shared the experience of personal tragedies. Mahaut's son died tragically in 1315, age 15, while Clémence's newborn son died mere days after his birth on November 14, 1316. Both women were dowagers who tragically lost not only their husbands, but also their sons, and thus had to work hard to remain culturally, politically, and socially relevant after losing the status of mother to a royal heir. As a result, Mahau and Clémence both fought to uphold their status at the French court through their patronage and possession of material luxuries, such as carved ivories. The 99-page inventory of Clémence's possessions, assembled after her death on October 13th, 1328, mere days after she wrote her last will and testament, includes several ivory objects. Clémence owned not only ivory mirbecks and a comb, as did Mahau, but also a chess set, a backgammon set, 12 buttons, 3 ivory boxes, and 2 small devotional sculptures of saints. Although both Mahau and Clémence owned multiple ivory objects, this does not seem to have been typical for all women of their standing within the French court. For example, Clémence's sister-in-law, Jeanne d'Evreux, Queen of France and Navarre, is believed to have owned few, if any, ivory objects, as suggested by their scarcity within her own inventory. The plethora of ivories in Mahau and Clémence's inventories, and lack thereof in Jeanne d'Evreux's, perhaps speaks to a personal like or dislike for ivory as an artistic medium. As the inventory entries show, Mahau and Clémence made conscious decisions to commission and purchase specific objets d'art. Not only does Clémence's inventory provide us with a glimpse into her material household, it also provides us with information as to how various luxury objects may have been considered and categorized during the late Middle Ages. The executors of Clémence's will, who were tasked with compiling the inventory in the days following her death, rather than detailing Clémence's collection of ivory objects in concurrent order, chose to place the various ivories into 3 different categories: clasps and other things, goldsmithery and silver vessels, and finally, velvet belts and other things and purses. As is evident from the titles of the categories, for the purpose of the inventory, the object's utility was prioritized over their material. There are also instances, such as inventory entry number 66, where several objects of both differing material and use are detailed together. The reason for the bundling together of these items in one entry appears to be that they were all purchased from Clémence's estate by a certain Pierre de Nille. This speaks to the reason for which Clémence's inventory was made, the cataloging and selling of her possessions after her death. The executors of Clémence's estate appear to have been more concerned with recording the details of the sale of her possessions than with the careful documentation of the production and provenance of individual objects. On the other hand, as documents created to serve as records of ongoing household expenditures, Mahau's inventories focus first and foremost on recording the production and provenance of her possessions. Although both Mahau's and Clémence's inventories include monetary prices for each item listed, the prices serve different purposes. The prices in Mahau's inventories refer to the amount she spent to acquire each item, while the prices in Clémence's inventory signify how much each object was worth or sold for as her estates were dismantled after her death. A final type of ivory object owned by Clémence that is worth considering in this case study are her 2 devotional statuettes, listed under the inventory category of velvet belts and other things and purses. Today, medieval ivory statuettes of saints are rare. That ivory statuettes were popular devotional tools for the medieval nobility and royalty is clear, however, as they appear fairly regularly in late medieval inventories, such as that of Clémence, as well as that of Mahau, who is recorded to have owned an ivory statuette of the Virgin Mary. That Clémence owned both sacred and secular carved ivories, such as devotional statuettes of saints, and luxury accessories, such as mirrors and combs, illustrates her desire to portray herself as a wealthy yet pious Christian woman. In addition to shedding light on the social status, religion, and wealth of artistic patrons, inventories can also tell us about the activities of medieval artisans. Mahau's inventories reference her patronage of an artisan named Jana, who worked for her on several occasions. One task was the illumination of an ivory mirror, among other small ivory objects, 2 ivory combs, as well as cases for the combs, and an ivory brooch. It is unfortunate that once again the inventory does not provide insight into the specific imagery with which Jana illuminated Mahaut's mirror case. However, from consideration of the imagery typically seen on extant 14th century ivory mirror cases, it is likely that Mahaut's mirror back was decorated with a romantic, courtly scene, such as the siege of the Castle of Love, which is found on 2 contemporaneous ivory mirror cases. In addition to illuminating the ivory mirror case, Jehan le Selleur appears in Mahaut's inventory in 2 other instances. He is recorded as being paid in 1322 for repairing an ivory image for the Countess, and in 1325 for selling an ivory statuette of the Virgin Mary to Mahaut for use in her tabernacle. That Jehan le Selleur was employed not only to create new ivory objects for Mahaut, but also to repair a broken or damaged ivory tells us 2 things. First, that Mahaut trusted and appreciated Jehan's artistic skill enough to employ him on more than one occasion. Secondly, that Mahaut had an ivory repaired rather than replaced speaks to the object's both monetary and sentimental worth to her. The ivory objects within Mahaut's inventory played a greater role than just material representations of her social prestige, Christian devotion, and wealth. Such objects could serve as tangible reminders